want to do an Australian Vote Compass for the 2013 election, and would you be interested? And it sounded very much, you know, like, I mean, it was initially very interesting to me, and then we went up to Sydney and we met some people there, and we met the founders of Vote Compass, and then we agreed to be part of it, and then subsequently I was involved in that one in 2013, then 2016, and then 2019, and then we did a Victorian election, I think it was 2014, so I've had a bit of experience doing this now. So I guess my motivation was quite a simple one, which was, I think it's sort of widely, well, let's just put it this way. I think a lot of our research doesn't get that far beyond the academic community, okay? And you can say that that's a good or bad thing, and I'm going to be agnostic on that. But this seemed like an opportunity to do something that would be a public engagement exercise, okay? And I didn't have any idea how successful it would be. It just appealed to my instincts in terms of public engagement. So I kind of basically signed on to it on that basis. And then the election was called, and I remember watching the ABC, and there was just like, you know, ad after ad after ad, okay? And I think in the first 24 hours, it got 100,000 responses. And then by the end of the election, it had, I think, in excess of 1 million responses. And then I think we've exceeded that in the 16 and 19 elections. 19, we had 1.6 million responses, okay? So I didn't actually expect it to be that successful, but it certainly has been. And this is a few comments from ABC, actually. So Mark Scott, then Managing Director, said, "We've been overwhelmed by the response to Vote Compass, which has far exceeded our expectations and mine. Vote Compass has positioned the ABC very well in this campaign." And then Alan Sunderland said, "There is no doubt Vote Compass has been one of the hits of their campaign, a great feather in the cap for the ABC in terms of policy engagement." So I think that, you know, my, I guess, happiness in its success is also shared by others. Okay, so what are the aims of Vote Compass? So the premise of the application is relatively straightforward. So based on respondents' answers to a series of public policy propositions, users are presented with an analysis of how their views compare with the positions of each of the political parties included in the instrument. So I'll show you a plot of that in a moment, but that's the basic idea, okay? And then I think the project is designed to achieve a couple of things. One, to stimulate voter engagement in election campaigns. So ABC are obviously thinking about how to do that. And one of the ways is to have this very attractive platform that you know, had a fair bit of uptake. So that's one motivation. The second is to spread awareness of the policy positions adopted by the parties. And this was a major motivation for me because I've subsequently done work on election promises. Now, in a lot of Western European contexts, you have an election manifesto that all parties release, and their promises are very, very clear. Okay, and then they can then be held accountable for them. And then, as a consequence, and this is some work I'm doing with Robert Thompson at Monash, as a consequence, it's easy to code whether parties kept their promises or not. Okay, now that is not the case in Australia. So it's a very opaque process. And then first of all, establishing where the parties stood on different issues was pretty difficult, and required, you know, research assistants doing a lot of work. Okay, and it shouldn't be that hard, because if you had like a policy manifesto, it would take you all of like, you know, a couple of hours to code all the parties. So part of it was to have some accountability and spread awareness around that. We probably do that mostly indirectly by people taking part in the platform. But there's also, if you look at the back end of the platform, there's lots of coding and there's lots of information about how we establish where the parties stand on these issues. And then I guess a corollary to that is to increase accountability of politicians to their platforms. I think well, and I can speak a bit later. We've very rarely been challenged on these platforms, but I think I can speak about a case later on in terms of One Nation and how I think we aided that process. And then the other aim was to prompt government to be more responsive to public opinion. So what I'll show you in a moment is like we had a series of policy releases that the ABC released, and then the idea was to have discussion around those policy or that public opinion, okay? And that sort of feeds into this point about we really wanted to move away from horse race politics, which is, you know, who's up, who's down, what did Shorten say yesterday, what did Morrison say the day after? So this intense obsession with, you know, political polls and leaders' personalities, we wanted to move away from that and then have more substantive discussion about policy. Okay, so that was another of the aims of Vote Compass. And then I just add is that we are not telling people how to vote. So some people call these voter advice applications, and we would much prefer to think of this as a voter literacy application. Okay, and that is because citizens can make up their minds as to who to vote for on a number of different dimensions, some worthy and some less worthy. But policy is only one of them, right? So you could be perfectly aligned with a party, but you don't trust the leader of that party, okay? Or you don't trust the party, or you think that there's some other reason they're not going to be able to execute that. And then there are other cases where parties just don't have the power to execute a platform, right? So there's a case of that, I think, where you might say, oh, I'm just going to vote for Labor or Liberal because I think they're going to be in power, so they can do that. So we are very careful to say that this is not telling people how to vote. It should just be one of a number of different pieces of information people use to decide how to vote. Okay, so I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the process of this. So what basically happened and has happened subsequently is the advisory board, that's about, there's probably at each time probably 10 or 15 of us in the room. And then it's actually kind of fun to begin with, and then it gets a bit more difficult as we go on, which is we just talk about what are the main election issues, okay? What do we think are the things that we have to cover off? What is in the media? What is important? And then we make some sort of assessment about how do we cover off what's important, what we can measure, what we think will be in the election. That's sometimes hard because you have to anticipate what issues are going to come up. Then we end up with about 100 questions, okay? And then we narrow that down to about 60, and then we pilot them because Vote Compass have a big sample, so we can pilot questions. And then we get down to the final 30 questions that are in the survey. But that actually takes a fair bit of work to actually to get there. We have to choose issues that the parties will differentiate on, okay? So if the parties agreed with all these issues, so they're all kind of like valence issues, then the instrument wouldn't work, okay? Because we couldn't actually separate the parties and we couldn't then separate respondents, okay? So we have to actually have issues that not only the major parties, but the Greens and in the more latter case, One Nation actually have some differences on. And then we have to code all of the parties' positions, okay? And that's a very laborious process. And we have a sort of hierarchy of evidence that we look at press releases, and then we look at speeches given, and then we try and sort of corroborate each piece of information. So we're pretty sure that we've represented the party's position. Then we send it to the parties, okay? And then they will tell us that yes, it's okay, or no, it's not. And we've had different levels of cooperation from different parties at different time periods, but at least one of the major parties has always cooperated. And I think in some ways, if I guess we are pretty confident in the way we've calibrated them, and we wouldn't put our names behind this if we weren't. So even if they did cooperate, I think they would just agree with the codings, okay? Now, we're not we're not sort of really defined in that. If they present us with better evidence than we have and say, you should change our position to X, then we're open to doing that. But they do have to present us with evidence that basically trumps the evidence that we have. And the other, and I think that has rarely happened, by the way, because the parties just agree with us because they've gone through a very deliberate process. I think there's been 1 or 2 cases where we might have moved them like 1 point on a Likert scale. And there's been 1 case where I think they changed their position during the election, and then we changed their coding as a consequence of that. Okay, but
formally contact you and say we've made a definitive change in our policy, or you just picked that up midstream of the election and did that?
I think we probably picked it up actually, and then we'd probably consult with them. So we have like a sort of advisory board, and then different people through different connections usually have a connection to the national president or whoever it is. So I think we're generally pretty good at picking them up. Then I guess the other thing I'd say is that what we're trying to do is develop easy to understand questions. So I've designed like a few academic surveys, and I think that this is a slightly different process from that. And it's actually a kind of interesting exercise in survey design, because I actually don't think when we design academic surveys, we actually pay enough attention to do ordinary people, in inverted commas, understand what we're asking them. Okay, and I know there was someone who was involved previously, Stanley Feldman from the US, who has a very long and distinguished record in survey design, and he said he found this process very helpful as well, just to try and really express the questions in everyday language. So what I'll do now is I'll just show you some of the questions that we had. So this is from 2019. So the first is political parties should have rules that require them to try and get a similar number of male and female candidates elected to Parliament. Okay, now that's probably a longer question than we'd like, but when we're sitting in a room, we decide that we have to include that information to then accurately represent the party's different positions. Okay, so and then you'll see we have this Likert scale. So all the questions have to go on a Likert scale. So that's strongly disagree, neutral to strongly agree. And that is so we can separate out the parties, and you'll see in the other questions that we basically follow that format. Here's another example. So how much money should out-of-work Australians receive in unemployment benefits? So this was where parties had a different position on this. And then people respond to that one. Australia should put a price on carbon emissions. And here we want to be very specific, because if we say we want to reduce carbon emissions, let's say, then the coalition, or they could say, well, we also have a plan to reduce carbon emissions, right? And then you could have an argument about whether it is, and I'm not going to take a position on that, but we want to have something very specific where you can't say, well, we also have a plan that will achieve the same thing. Okay, so that was that question. The government should fund expansion of preschool to 3-year-olds. So if you recall, that was also another pretty major issue, with a really large budgetary implication as well in the previous election. How many immigrants should Australia admit? And this was another big one. There should be fewer tax breaks on investment properties, so the negative gearing, and so that's another example. And then I just mentioned one interesting example from 2019, which we wanted to include a question on franking credits. And I don't think we've ever come up with an issue where we couldn't develop a question that in some ways actually caught the issue. And we spent a lot of time on this, right? Sort of coming up with different questions about how we could capture it, and we consulted a lot of people. And none of us in the end were happy that we actually caught the complexity of that issue. And the other thing is we don't just go off our priors, we actually test that. So then we put that in the field, okay, and we've got a pretty large sample. And I think we got about 20% don't knows, right, which is actually one of the highest you'll see on any question. And then on the basis of that, we actually excluded that question. But that, I think, is the first time that has ever happened to us. So so that was actually pretty interesting. Then we have how you fit on the landscape. Okay, so there's two sort of axes here. So social conservative and social progressive, and then economic left and economic right. And then we have a plot. We have the Greens. So the Greens are to the left, obviously. ALP are more in the middle. Liberal National are in the middle, but to the right. And then One Nation down here. Okay, so I don't know whether that's a perfect representation actually, but that's an example at any rate of what we're sort of dealing with, the broad parameters. And then the respondent is placed somewhere, and here they're in the middle, okay? But they could be anywhere, so they could be here, or they could be here, or they could be here, or they could be up here, okay? So based on the responses to their questions, then they are included. And so we always had Liberal, National, ALP and Greens, and then we had One Nation, and I can maybe talk about that in question time, some of the reasons for including that and some of the complications as well. Okay, so basically it is a platform that is designed in a user-friendly way to inform respondents of where they're positioned to the next to the parties, and also I hope in going through it, people give some thought to the things that we're presenting them with. Okay, so they think about different policy issues and it achieves that as well. Okay, so the second part of this is, like I was saying before, about the discussion around policy issues. So that was another of my sort of main motivations. And then what we did is we had rolling releases of the public opinion based on the responses to Vote Compass. And I should say this is like we could speak about this for a very long time, because some people say this is not representative data, and that's absolutely true. So people opt into the survey. So by nature, it's not representative because it's not a random sample, it's an opt-in sample. And I can speak more about this in question time perhaps. So basically we have ways of then having that approximate representative data. So we then weight the data on characteristics which we have measures on, so gender, age, location, and then we have other information as well on respondents. And then we're able to get estimates that are pretty close to what we'd get if we ran a representative survey. Now, that is not uncomplicated, and the mechanics behind achieving that are very complicated and to some controversial. I don't think they're that controversial myself, but if you're wondering how we're reporting on public opinion based on an opt-in sample, then there are methods behind that that we use to achieve that. So just to give you an example of that, if we have, let's just use an easy example. If 80% of our respondents are women, and we know that, in the general population that 50% of respondents are women, then we weight that down, and then we have different census information on different characteristics that we use. And we also, if the respondent has provided it, have information on past vote as well, so we can weight people on different, it's called like multi-level post-stratification. And it's what a lot of people are using to deal with these problems of non-representative data. So we have then that data. So we have a question on negative gearing, and then we have, so you can see here what Vote Compass tells us about negative gearing. And then it says here, a clear majority of Labor and Greens voters want to cut back investment property concessions. About 47% of coalition voters oppose any move towards property tax breaks, and then we can report on public opinion and how it sort of splits across the population based on that. And again, that should promote discussion about about that particular issue. And then we have those on a number of different issues as well. And I think the ABC are getting better at devising, I guess, more interesting ways to present data as well. So data visualization, Matthew Liddy in particular, who's very good at this. And this is some, using the data that we got from the survey, it is showing if the population were 100 people, then where would people, where do people sit on this question about whether Australia should accept more immigrants? You see, people are really divided about that. So that's more, that's fewer, and that's neutral. It's interesting, don't know. So 2% of people said don't know. So it seems a lot of people have some sort of opinion on that. And we see the response was split. And then if you go on the website, then you can split that up into different demographics as well. So where the Labor voters fall on that, where the One Nation voters fall on that, where the coalition voters, where the young people fall on that. So there's actually really interesting information on that. And then this is just another example. So nearly 70% agreed that immigrant cultural values didn't make people less Australian. We just have all sort of specific policy issues, but we also have more general questions about these sort of things as well. Okay, so that is, how am I going for time, Tim?
You've got 7, 8 minutes.
Okay, that's about right. Great. Okay, so the final thing I'll talk about is, so the original motivation for me was just like a public engagement exercise, and I don't think we published anything for a little while, and then eventually we thought, well, we should really try and build this into our academic research, and we've got all of this data. By the way, the data is actually really difficult to analyze because we have about 1 million observations, and you need you can't just like use a regular computer, and I think you need to use like an off-campus server just to run the analysis on the data. Okay, so it's not an easy process to do, and because of what I was speaking about before about multi-level post-stratification, then that's even more complicated because you're dealing with all sorts of complicated weighting issues that are difficult as well. Okay, so at any rate, we have done some. I guess between all of us, have maybe published 10 papers using Vote Compass data. And one of the things that we tested in an article, which you can find in the Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, is testing whether Mediscare actually had an effect on vote choice. So if you recall, Mediscare was this ad that the Labor Party released shortly before the election saying that the Liberals had a plan to privatise healthcare. Okay, and then there was an ad, if you recall, with Bob Hawke, and he was made to look intentionally, sort of gaunt, saying that the coalition are going to privatise healthcare, and then they had these ads. And I should acknowledge Andrea Carson, who's speaking at this series in a few weeks. She does a lot of work on media, so we actually coded media use, so we knew when the different ads took place. And I won't present that here, but that's in the article. So we looked with this is kind of like a multi-method in a way, because we did coding of media, and then we looked at how that compared with the Vote Compass data. So then we have this, okay, which is I'll just present the simplification of this, but this is I think this is the Hawke advertisement as the break point, and these are the days of the campaign, and these are the public responses to that, and then there's a line obviously through those. Okay, and this is by the way not intention to vote. This is the salience of healthcare. So what we hypothesized is that this ad increased the salience of health in people's minds. And then we can actually measure that because we've got people who are actually assessing the salience of health and saying how important it is to them, because there's another part of the platform which measures this throughout the campaign. Now, the beauty of that, if you will, is that we have a lot of responses every day. we have at least 10,000 people responding to that question every day. And then on the busy days, we have about 100,000 responses to that. Okay, so first of all, traditional polling companies wouldn't really poll on a question like this very often. And then if they did, they'd do it very irregularly. Okay, so then you could say, well, what happened before and after that? But it's pretty messy. So this maybe illustrates this better, because this is the potential vote. So I think this is intention to vote. And then this is the same breakpoint. And again, if you look at all the polls conducted over the, 50 days of the campaign, there might be, I don't know, like maybe 30 polls, right? So you've just got not many data points. You've got one here, one here, one here, one here, and then one here, and then one, right? Whereas with this platform, we're getting intention to vote every day. And then we can look at campaign effects in a much more kind of finely grained way than if we just had to say, well, this poll here said X, and then this poll here said Y, okay? And then make some assumption, which is what a lot of the journalism around polls is about. And that's putting to one side the issues that we've had with polls lately. Then if that went from there to there, is that because of Mediscare or is it because of something else, right? And it's actually really difficult to disentangle that. But we have intention to vote every day, right? So we're getting these really finely calibrated measures, and then we can look at that after the campaign out. And what we conclude basically is that Mediscare stalled a decline in the Labor vote. Okay, so it looked like Labor vote was going down, and then it basically sort of flattened out. Okay, so it probably just stopped them from a bigger electoral route. And this is 2016. And then we're doing other things as well, and we've published other papers using that data. But that's one testing that idea. Okay, so I think I'll end there. So that's the final figure, I think, from the 2019 election. As you can see, Vox Pop Labs, ABC and University of Melbourne, but there was others from Sydney, and Andrea Carson and others were involved in this. It's sometimes it's sometimes hard actually, because it does involve a lot of work, and there are different parties, and then we're navigating between all those parties. But I think as a public engagement tool, I've been really delighted with how successful it's been. I'd like to think it's played some small part in educating the broader population about the policy positions of the parties, which is, I guess, my primary aim in being a part of that. So I guess it will be happening again whenever the next election is, and I'll be a part of it again, because I think that it's been a great public engagement tool. So hopefully that gives you some insight into sort of what is behind the black box that we call Vote Compass.